Sawadee Krap. Hello and welcome to another Victor Black Masterclass video. In today's video, I'm going to be introducing the Black Death leg dominant training program for the less than genetically gifted, the anabolically resistant, I like to term them. Now, the reason I'm making this particular video, it is unashamedly is intended as a primer, an introduction to the training model. Really, you can see this as a marketing material, if you wish. Clearly, there will be significantly more detailed, more granular information that's available to individuals that purchase the training program or undertake the training program. I think it's important when people consider, is this the type of program that might suit me and my unique needs? That at least some information is available about, how does this program work? So I think it's only fair that I give away some insight into how the program works so that people can then look at this and consider, is this the type of training program that's the right choice for them at this point in their training career? So let's get started with the video. I think the place to start this video is explaining why I created this video. Now, I fully accept the fact that you are not going to see very many IFBB professional bodybuilders training this way. 100% agree. Why is that? Quite bluntly, because they don't need to. And if I didn't need to train this way, and if my clients didn't need to train this way, I probably wouldn't train this way. There's a reason that I promote this type of training methodology. And that is quite bluntly because much of what we are still taught even today in our tribe is the legacy of the genetically gifted. In other words, such and such, insert name of successful bodybuilder, trained in this manner, it worked fabulously well for them, and therefore people try to emulate that, follow that. And there's nothing wrong with that. Certainly something I did for a very long time, but I was always frustrated by it. And I believe there are a number of reasons for that. Quite bluntly, if I'm very honest, after 34 years of training, I would say the more genetically gifted an individual is, the more they can get away with, the more corners they can cut and still be successful. And the less genetically gifted you are, the older you are, potentially the more you have on your plate if you're a family man with 3 kids and a career and you try and train and quite often you have to be a little bit more granular. You can't take as many shortcuts. So one of the things I find ironic about our tribe is people tend to say things like, well, I'm not a professional, I'm not quote unquote that serious. And although I understand the intent, I would say that I am probably more structured in many of the things that I do because I'm not genetically gifted and because I can't get away with taking shortcuts. I have to be very structured. I have to be very detailed. I have to be very granular in almost everything I do. And the older I get, the closer I get to, that day that, progression is no longer possible. And I'm still getting better, in my opinion, at 53 years old. In order for that to happen, it doesn't happen, quote unquote, by accident. It takes a very deliberate set of well-intended and well-structured plans executed, I have to use the word flawlessly, for me to progress at this training age. So this program is not intended to basically challenge the programs that are typically used by the genetically gifted. They tend to gravitate towards a program because they walk into the gym, they start training, they start growing, and it works. And quite bluntly, pretty much everything works. I created this program for those of us out there that feel that they are anabolically resistant, less than genetically gifted, if you will. For those people that don't tend to respond as well as they would like to. So let's start walking through the program. And as I said, I will endeavor to give as much insight into the program as I can so that individuals can say, yes, that sounds like something that is for me, or no, it's not the right choice for you. Firstly, I would like to say this, and that is traditionally training programs are sold in silos. And what I mean by that is, there's a training strategy or training program itself. Someone else is selling a diet book or a diet model. Someone else, is making a recommendation about drug, pattern usages or PD use. Very, very rarely do you see something which is an integrated model that covers everything. Okay. And I think that's kind of important because, in my opinion, there are probably four main areas: lifestyle, training, diet, and supplements and drugs, that if you don't get them all right, kind of it creates a bottleneck in success. That you have to reach a minimum threshold, as it were, in each of these four areas for the magic to happen. And we see this time and time again with guys on Facebook groups and forums talking about drug use, and quite eye-watering doses. When you go and look at their profiles and look at who they are, they barely look like they train. The years of high-level drug use and very little to show for it. And there's probably no better example of the fact that just the drugs don't produce the results. You have to have all of these elements and all these strategies lined up correctly, complementary to each other for the magic to happen. And that's why this program covers all of these areas. So it is literally nutrition, training, supplementation, and PED use. All of these things are covered under this program. Okay. The second big thing that you'll often find, especially amongst the genetically gifted, is most people work in what I call like digital jumps. In other words, there's maintenance. If we talk about caloric intake for a moment, there's this idea of like maintenance substrate, surplus substrate, and deficit substrate. So people very often will go into a dieting phase and they'll immediately drop to 500 or 800 calories under maintenance value to create a deficit position. And I understand that. That's fair enough. It tends to work pretty well when you're dieting. It's probably not, tremendously beneficial to kind of have an incremental step down when you're dieting. Just drop down to 500 and get moving. But very, very often you'll see guys that talk about, coming out of a maintenance position or even coming out of a deficit position and, immediately going to surplus substrates in the vicinity of, 500, 600, 1,000 calories a day. And I've certainly done this myself. And quite bluntly, all that happens is I tend to get very fat very fast. And so we'll be talking about some methodologies here that are no secret. I think everybody today has probably heard of this concept of reverse dieting. But reverse dieting tends to refer to this idea that you slowly and incrementally back out of a caloric deficit over a time block in small increments. But of course, we can use this framework to assist us to great effect, even when we're talking about increasing surplus substrates. And we'll talk about that in detail as we go on. The simple takeaway from this slide is many people in this community tend to move in digital jumps. In other words, the cycle starts on day one, week one, and they're straight out the gate with 1,000 milligrams of testosterone and on day one. Hell, I would go one step further and say there is a huge segment of the community that actually participate in things like the use of oral steroids to get, what quote unquote what they call a fast start. And obviously that's absolute folly. If you follow my content, you'll appreciate that. But even you see people getting involved in front loading and things like that. And I'll explain as we go through here why I'm just not a fan of those types of strategies. They don't, in my opinion, justify the stress that they cause for the return they offer. So this is, as I said, a graphical representation of how most people approach PED use. It's on, off. It's a digital switch, as it were. So let's start with a Captain Obvious statement and talk a little bit about maintenance here. Now, I am not a fan of spending tremendous amounts of time in maintenance, principally because maintenance, almost by definition, is the antithesis of progress. You're neither washing off body fat nor potentially growing new tissue when you're in a maintenance phase. But it's important to start with that understanding, because when you do that, you can understand that what it takes to grow tissue or what it takes to wash off body fat is profoundly different than what it takes to basically maintain your current position. So let's talk about maintenance, by comparison to a growth phase to begin with. It's important to understand that the amount of volume load that you need to expose, skeletal tissue to create maintenance, in other words, to not lose tissue, is vastly, vastly different to what it potentially requires to grow new tissue. In other words, I won't be presenting, evidence references throughout this material. I'm hoping that most people will accept these things as very well understood by our communities today. There's certainly an abundance of evidence that supports these statements. But in about 5 hard working sets per body part per week is more than enough stimulus to basically maintain tissue from a training stimulus input point of view. Okay. Now, are you going to grow new tissue at 5 hard working sets a week? Extremely unlikely. If you're genetically gifted, you might. But for most people, that's enough to basically hold the tissue they have, provided they have good sleep hygiene practices and good stress management practices, provided they have a maintenance intake of the right calories and the right macronutrient profiles, and particularly if they are using some sort of pharmacology, even at what I would call, plausibly natural, within physiological range or slightly outside that, what I call the supernatural man. So in other words, at my age, at 53 years old, if I wanted to basically back down now and say, look, I'm just going to hang out here, most people would be surprised how little drugs, how little food, and how little training it takes to just kind of, exist, just to stay where you are, to hold on to what you have got. Okay. As I said, 40 sets a week, 40 hard working sets a week. Literally the word maintenance calories means that's the point. The scale's neither rising nor falling. And as I said, a supernatural man type, PED strategy, enhancement strategy, minimal stress, and you can create, for all intents and purposes, maintenance. Yes, I do agree that there are individuals that come off cycles and lose 50 or 60 pounds. But to be honest with you, that probably says more about the drugs use they were using and the way they trained when they were, on cycle rather than anything else. Especially even over the COVID period, I think a lot of people were surprised by how little tissue they lost when we weren't actually able to train. I had clients that couldn't get to the gym and were still growing. So it was a very insightful period of time with people understanding just how little it takes to kind of hang on to the tissue you've got, how quickly it comes back even if you lose a few pounds. So, hello, Captain Obvious statement. There's maintenance and then there's growth phase. Now, once we enter growth phase, we are going to have to accelerate these inputs or increase these inputs in some meaningful manner over a time block. We cannot continue to do the smallest volume that will maintain tissue. We cannot grow on maintenance calories. We need a surplus. Obviously, yes, I do agree, there are exceptions to that. This concept of body recomposition is not only plausible for an over-fat beginner, I would set as an expectation, but it's fair to say that for most advanced trainers, you are probably going to need to increase your training volume, increase your caloric intake, and increase your growth promotion use over a time block to realize significant growth. Hello, Captain Obvious, right? So it's easiest, in my opinion, to look at this in this way, and that is, let's say we pick a 12-week growth phase. I like to suggest that people do the Victor Black Black Death program over 12 weeks. The premise here is that if we start from what we'll call, D-Day, here, sorry, come back up, week 1, as it were, I see no plausible, supportable reason that you need to go from maintenance calories to 1,000 calories over maintenance on day 1. Yes, I have tried that. Yes, I know lots of people do that. And I know people also take a half measure where they'll jump up 500, then 750, then 1,000. These are quite big increments, though. And quite bluntly, for the anabolically resistant, you can't possibly use that amount of calories in a positive fashion. And all that tends to happen is you get, rather fat, rather fast. So I'm going to go through the 3 inputs here that we change over time. So if we look at calories, let's say on week 1, we were to do nothing more than keep our protein values where they are under maintenance values, keep our fat values where they are under maintenance, but slowly, incrementally increasing carbohydrate substrate, just even by as little as 25 grams a day. That's just 100 calories a day, but week by week. So in the first week, that would just be 100 calories over maintenance. But as the growth promotion phase increases over time, then we slowly increase that. By the time you got to week 12 in these circumstances, you would be ingesting 1,200 calories or 300 grams of carbohydrates more than you would be under maintenance. So hopefully people can see it is utilizing carbohydrate substrate in a fairly significant way. There's quite a lot of food going in there. I do believe that you need to eat big to grow big, but I don't believe in the digital jump. I believe that you need to slowly and incrementally increase caloric substrate, carbohydrate substrate over a time block for it to be correctly utilized. Mindful of blood glucose levels and whether we're utilizing those substrates in a positive fashion by monitoring and tracking our progress. So the first thing is we're increasing caloric intake. Now, obviously, the potential problem with increasing caloric intake over time eventually becomes food fatigue, where eventually, not week 1, not week 2, but eventually week 10, week 12, that's a lot of food, 1,200 calories over maintenance. You become fatigued by that. There is a point where it's like, you start looking at, another bowl of rice, you're going to puke. So it's a very real thing. There are obviously strategies that we can utilize to avoid that. But in my opinion, there is no greater strategy than starting off slowly and walking into it, gradually increasing the calories over time. And we do the same thing with volume load, and we do the same thing with growth promoters. And each of these inputs have potential downside. Obviously, as we increase volume load over time, we increase the risk of injury. As we increase volume load over time, we potentially increase the stress on soft tissues, tendons, joints, etc. Okay. And at the same time, as we potentially increase growth promoters from physiological range or just outside of physiological range during maintenance value, over time, as we increase that, two things are going to happen. Oxidative stress will elevate, and consequentially to that, you will start to see adverse effect on your health. And the second thing is, at some point in time, you are going to see myostatin elevation, which is ultimately what prevents you in ongoing runaway anabolic growth, even under using anabolic steroids and other PEDs. A lot of people, even today, mistakenly believe that it's androgen receptor downregulation that causes this, but this is simply not true. Androgen receptors do not downregulate in the presence of androgens, they upregulate in the presence of androgens. And there is no evidence to put a cap on where that happens. Okay, so the more androgens you take, the more androgen receptors basically that are created to support that level of androgen use. Unfortunately, the body has biological methodologies to prevent runaway growth. Fortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, from a bodybuilding point of view, that's not great, but it does certainly make sense biologically. And so what happens is at some point you'll start to see escalation of myostatin, which then blunts the hypertrophic effect. So at some point, more and more and more drugs just continues to basically create greater and greater levels of oxidative stress and toxicity without greater and greater hypertrophic return. So we'll talk about that as we move forward. So let's just talk about volume load. In this program, basically what we would do is we'd say, look, most individuals are capable of training between about 80 and 100 hard working sets a week. That's, the capacity to do the work and recover, okay? There are factors that both lower that recoverable volume and increase that recoverable volume. So the more drugs you take, you typically improve recovery. The older you get, sex, other commitments you have, do you have a career? Do you have children? all these sorts of things. So genetics, there's just a baseline genetics here. It's fair to say that most individuals that are watching this will be able to do somewhere between 80 and 100 80 and 120 hard working sets a week. So when we understand that, you can then ask the question, so how are we going to divide up those sets? Are we going to divide them up evenly across all body parts? If we say, look, there's 8 different body parts. We have quads, hamstrings, calves, chest, back, shoulders, biceps, triceps. That's 8. We can divide that total volume work capacity into 8 equal parts and distribute them relatively evenly. Or what we can do is we can disproportionately allocate volume. Now, that might seem like a novel thing to do, but it is by no means is it novel. If you simply think about push-pull legs, what push-pull legs is doing is allocating 66% of your total training volume to your upper body and 33% of your total training, to your lower body. By definition, you're doing 2 days of upper body training and then 1 day of legs. So that means there's an imbalance there. One body part a day, typical, what they like to call a bro split, is different again. That's where you're doing 80% of your training volume on the upper body and 20% on legs. So what we're doing with this model is not rocket science. You just rarely see people train this way, in so much as that what we're going to do is we're going to disproportionately allocate those 80 to 120 hard working sets, biasing that volume towards our legs. Okay. Most training programs significantly bias training volume to the upper body. Okay. And I see a lot of guys, that do Monday's International Chest Day and Tuesday's Back Day and Wednesday's Shoulders Day and Thursday's Arm Day and Friday's is Legs Day, and they don't have great legs. Now, they're genetically gifted. They probably do. They probably respond very nicely. But this is why a great many people will choose something like push-pull legs, because they feel that is too much volume to the upper body and they need to spend a little bit more attention on the legs. That's the rationale behind push-pull legs, okay? It's not training your legs once a week. It's training your legs, in a greater frequency. So this training model isn't breaking the paradigm. It's just saying rarely, very, very rarely will you see a training program that says, I'm going to allocate more training volume to my legs than I will my upper body. And that is what underlies the training component of this program. It's very rare to see, but it's not terribly complicated to understand the rationale, the logic behind it. Okay. So if we quickly look at training volume load targets, most people would accept that about 5 hard working sets a week is enough training volume to basically maintain tissue mass. That if you want to grow tissue, you probably need to allocate about 10 hard working sets per body part per week. And you can then increase the number of those training sets somewhere between 10 and 20, maybe even a little bit more, 25 sets a week, depending on how you're going to basically break that up. And so this is where we end up with this idea of, so if it's 5 working sets a week and there's 8 body parts, that's 40 sets a week. If there's 10 working sets, 10 hard working sets, and there's 8 body parts, that's 80 sets a week, okay? So what we're doing here is basically allocating more hard working sets to our legs than we are to our upper body. Very straightforward, very simple. Yes, I do agree there are some potential problems with that if you go too far. If you go too far into overreaching, you raise the risk of overtraining and you raise the risk of an increased injury outcome proportional to your training efforts. Okay, so we need to find a fine balance between that. In my opinion, this training model falls short of risk in that area. Okay, it is not super, super high volume. As I said, if you looked at something like an upper-lower split by definition would say okay, I'm going to give 40 sets a week to my upper body and 40 sets a week to my legs. And I don't think anybody would say that an upper-lower split, divided that way, significantly increases the load-injury relationship. Not necessarily the way. Many people successfully train an upper-lower split. Yes, I do agree we go one step further than that, and I'll talk about the actual ratios in just a second, but we need to be mindful of the fact there is an optimal point in terms of volume load that we want to hit, right, without overstepping the boundary and pushing ourselves too far into overreaching and raising our risk of injury here. Okay, so this slide briefly talks about what that is. So in the Black Death Legs program, on week 1, we have 79 sets, 40 sets is to upper body, 39 sets is to legs. That's pretty much what you would call an upper-lower split. Okay. Now, what separates this program is our progression model over the next 4 weeks incrementally increases volume load through set progression only on the leg component. So when we get to week 4, we are basically at about 40% of the volume is on upper body and about 60% is on legs. Okay. So yes, we're biasing that, but not to the point where I would be concerned about overreaching and raising our injury profile. Perhaps the most asked question I get about this model is people are worried that if we bias volume away from upper body, will they lose muscle tissue from the upper body? And the answer is, well, if you think about it, right, who's going to say that you're going to lose muscle tissue if you do an upper-lower split, which is 50-50? No one in their right mind would say, look, if I did an upper-lower split, I'm going to lose upper body tissue. That I don't think anyone's going to claim that. So how far do we go in this program? Well, we're going kind of one step further than that. We're saying, well, we're going to go to 40%, 60%. It's not like we're not training our upper body. We're just biasing volume load here. Hopefully that makes sense. And people who are familiar with the concept know that 40 sets to upper body a week, you will not lose any tissue, I promise you. Now, you might not gain at the optimal rate. I completely agree with that. But the purpose of this program is to focus on leg development. So if at the end of 12 weeks, we literally saw no progress in upper body, all right, but we saw significant progress on leg development, that would be, in my book, let's take that and call that a win. Okay, so this is the model I talked about, carbohydrate intake. Over the 12-week program, we're going to keep our proteins at the same level. We're going to keep our fats at the same level. And we're going to incrementally increase our carbohydrate intake by as little as 25 grams a day, understanding that by the time we get to week 12, we will be basically, quite frankly, force feeding ourselves. That's 1,200 caloric surplus. That's a lot of food. And you will ultimately realize a degree of food fatigue. You will get sick of eating this, but this is part of the nature of growth. Unfortunately, in this game, optimal growth and optimal fat loss, you are either perpetually in the state of being hungry. If you want to, create, fat loss at the fastest rate possible, you're going to be hungry. Or if you want to grow tissue at the fastest rate possible, you're going to, unfortunately, go through periods of time, not all the time, but periods of time where you feel overfed. As you can see, over a 12-week time frame, it's extremely unlikely on week 1 at 100 calories over maintenance value that you're going to feel overfed. That's not going to happen. Week 2, week 3, but at some point in time, food fatigue starts to kick in here. We need to try and have the mental fortitude and the willpower to push through that period and keep going. So the last thing I really wanted to talk about in this introductory video was really the use of growth promoters or PEDs. Okay. Now, obviously, what we are trying to do, the goal of any pharmacological model is to maximize the therapeutic potential or the therapeutic benefits of drugs, whilst we minimize the toxicity that they create. We minimize the side effects. So really, this idea of a day one going to full tilt, it doesn't make any sense. What you basically are talking about there is you're saying, okay, so if I enter into a growth phase on day one, I'm going to take all of the growth promoters on day one. I think if we turn it around for purposes of explanation and explain it from a dieting model, it will make more sense to people. If you're going to wash off body fat, and if you're going to use a combination of caloric deficit and cardiovascular energy expenditure, let's call it, and pharmacological fat burners, I don't think anyone in their right mind is going to put all of those things on the table at full power on day one. In other words, you may well end up in competition state. You're on relatively low calories. You might have to suffer at the end of the journey. And you may well end up doing, an hour or even more of cardio a day. It certainly happens, okay? And you may well end up with quite an array of pharmacological fat burners on the table, but no one is going to tell you need to do that on day one, right? That's something that you would accelerate over a 20-plus week time frame. You slowly reduce your caloric intake, you slowly increase your energy expenditure, and you slowly increase your use of pharmacological fat burners, ever increasingly moving towards the stage, all right? But for some strange reason, when we turn it around and go back the other way and talk about growth promotion, people think that you need to put yourself into full caloric surplus on day one, that you need to go into full training volume on day one, and you need all of the growth promoters on day. As I said, the ludicrous thing is that they'll even front load it. It makes no sense. It's the equivalent in a dieting phase saying, I'm going to front load clenbuterol 200 micrograms a day, a ridiculous amount, by the way, because I need to, for some reason, I need to get a fast start. It's like, no. Slowly, incrementally increasing the inputs, is the way that dieting is done in the most efficient and safest way possible. And when we talk about the use of growth promoters, where we want to realize the maximum therapeutic benefit with the smallest amount of toxicity, you turn it around and do exactly the same thing in growth phase. You slowly walk these things in, okay? So basically what that means is you might end up with 10, 15 different drugs, and you may well end up with dosages that are significantly above what I'll call physiological range. I don't really have a problem with that, but we don't need to execute all of that on day one. Just gradually, slowly, introducing them over time frame. Now, every single person out there is going to have a different acceptable risk threshold. This is fair. Some people are extremely risk averse. Some people are more driven by outcomes than managing their risk profile, and that's fine. What I'm going to explain here is that HRT type doses, right, are relatively efficient in terms of creating tissue gain and creating body recomposition with very little toxicity. Okay, as you raise that dose, you see an increase in efficacy with very little toxic effect up to a certain threshold. There is a point that you cross, a line that you cross, where you start to see the toxicity associated with those drugs, the oxidative stress involved with those drugs. As you raise the dose and as you increase the polypharmacy nature of this thing, it gets greater and greater and greater. And there's a point whereby the toxicity overpowers the efficacy. So we need to hold off that moment in time as long as we can, as long as possible, okay? So what I would recommend here is that, as always, that we are going to spend most of our time in growth promotion using what I refer to as basal or daily use PEDs. These are drugs that have current or historical clinical human use, that we have very good safety and efficacy data to consider, so we can say, look, it's not always good news, but it's kind of better the devil you know what you get when you use these drugs, because they are very well documented in humans. So most of the time we will be using these drugs, but I am not, I never say this, I'm not opposed to someone having a strategy that is behind that we would use for situational or breakthrough use. In other words, breaking through a plateau or if we're going to use it for the competition. Now, in this particular case, because this is a growth promotion strategy, we'd be talking about using something that is a slightly higher risk drug profile as a breakthrough drug, as a stall breaker, as it were. So let me quickly go through the types of drugs that are outlined in this model. As always, I recommend that you have a testosterone base. If you haven't followed my content about testosterone and why you should have a testosterone base, then this is probably not the model for you. Estrogen is not the enemy and DHT is not the enemy. You should have a testosterone base. How much testosterone is the question that people always ask. And as I say, as much testosterone as you could tolerate as a genetically unique individual without the need for an aromatase inhibitor or DHT blocker. And for many people, that's probably about 300 to 350, maybe in some individuals, 400 milligrams a week. It's very difficult to justify that you need more than 300 or 400 milligrams a week as a testosterone base. Rather, we are going to use a tissue-selective drug, a steroidal SARMs like primobolan or MASTEL, which are fabulous drugs, as the primary growth promoter here. So testosterone is there to provide a base of sexual function, of cognitive function, of provide the benefits of estrogen, provide the benefits of DHT, and we're going to use a tissue-selective drug like primobolan and MASTEL as the primary growth promoter. A small amount of trenbolone, as little as 100 milligrams a week, will be used here. Now, a lot of people will scoff and say that's not enough. You don't understand how trenbolone works then. If you don't understand, when trenbolone was in human clinical use, its clinical dosage was 50 milligrams a week, okay? 100 milligrams a week, right, is plenty to elicit the benefits that trenbolone, really only trenbolone, can bring to the table, okay? 100 milligrams a week of trenbolone is what 400 milligrams a week of testosterone is to 200 milligrams. It's enough, as it were. Yes, I'm a fan of recombinant human growth hormone if you could afford it. And so there is an allocation for a small amount in this cycle, even as little as 2 IU, 3 IU. You certainly don't need to be using 6, 7, 8, 10 IU a day. I do not think that that is in any way supportable. A couple of units a day is a fabulous addition and complementary drug, synergistic drug here. There's an allocation for those people that use insulin. Insulin is a very controversial drug, but in my opinion, it is a drug that is massively misunderstood, and it is a drug that has benefits from an anti-aging perspective. When you are smashing down the amount of carbohydrates that you are eating under growth promotion, day after day after day, you are placing a tremendous strain on your pancreas, okay? 1,200 calories in excess of maintenance under growth phase is a load on your pancreas that you can take off by using insulin in an intelligent and articulate way. So we will basically have some insulin for those that use insulin. And if you don't use insulin, that's fine. I don't have a problem with it. An insulin sensitizer like metformin or berberine, anybody that uses super physiological levels of androgens should be using an ARB specifically for the purposes of angiotensin II suppression. A great many of the problems that we experience from PED use today find their way all the way back to angiotensin II, from blood pressure elevation to stress on our kidneys to cognitive function issues to, and can be traced straight back to the doorway of angiotensin II. And in my opinion, anybody that is not using an ARB and using super physiological levels of androgens is, living in the 1970s, as it were. I favor telmisartan because telmisartan is a PPAR agonist as well as an ARB. It is the only one of 8 ARBs that has a dual role. And of course, a PPAR agonist is, most people are familiar with drugs like GW1516. This, however, is a drug that has been approved for human use and passed its toxicology testing rather than failed its toxicology testing. Injectable carnitine, I'm a huge fan. All of these drugs are what I would call basal drugs. I showed you that slide before. Daily use, these are firm friends that you are going to get to know. They have very good efficacy profiles, very tolerable safety profiles, and they are all approved for human use or have been in human clinical use for decades, including trembolone. Okay. There is one exception here is I always like to put this drug aside and hopefully we'll not use it. It is the drug Anadrol. It is, in my opinion, one of the most potent drugs that we have as a breakthrough drug, as a stall breaker. Okay. The problem with it is Anadrol is not only a very potent drug, it is potentially a very toxic drug. It is the one anabolic steroid that is a known carcinogen. And so I always recommend that people use it very sparingly. Ideally, what we will be doing here is putting this in the drawer and not pulling it out. Why would we pull it out? Because we get to a point in the growth promotion strategy that we are not progressing, that we're not moving forward towards our goals. And I don't see the point of taking all of these drugs and spending all this money and eating all that food and leaving it wanting for a small amount of Anadrol. It is not a drug that you live on. It is not a drug that forms the basis of every PED cycle. It is, in my opinion, a drug that lives in the bottom drawer. And if you are spending all this time and all this money on this thing and you are not realizing your goals, that is not going to happen in week 1. That is not going to happen in week 2. But it's quite plausible. You get to week 8, week 9, you're struggling a little bit. You need to get through the last 30 days. Then that's when drugs like Anadrol as a situational use or a breakthrough drug makes sense. Okay. So in summary, that's basically an overview of what this model is. It is a model that explains a nutritional program. It is a model that explains a training program. It is a model that explains a PED use program that is incremental or granular in nature. It is not a cycle that begins on week 1 and ends on week 16 or whatever with these drugs that you run through. It is a drug that slowly, very slowly, let's go back up to our top slide here. Very slowly over time, we increase our training volume load from 80 to 100 hard working sets a week. We increase our caloric intake from 100 calories a day, 25 grams of carbohydrate substrate, each week, ultimately getting to 1,200 calories a day in surplus. And we increase our anabolic growth promotion tools from supernatural man through to what I would call client's maximum risk profile. And that's going to vary for everybody. Some people are not going to want to use insulin, and that's fine. Some people are not going to be able to afford recombinant human growth hormone, even at 2 or 3 units a day, and that's fine, right? But it is, in my opinion, a strategy that will produce fabulous results for the anabolically resistant at what I would call tolerable levels of risk. Right? Why are they tolerable levels of risk? Fundamentally, what it comes down to this. Over this 12-week growth cycle, right at the very end, it's fair to say in the last, in 1/3 of this cycle, that the escalation of the dosages that we'll be using here could be considered to be unsustainable. I have no problem with that statement, right? Because I would not be living on them either, right? But you have to look at this and say, well, how many of these cycles are we going to do over a 1-year period? And how many weeks during that cycle have we crossed that threshold from, okay, tolerable to, that's probably unsustainable? Some, okay, some. This program is trying to find a balance for people that want to say, look, I'm going to use more than TRT here. I'm not going to be walking around on granddad's TRT here. So Victor, help me out with a program that's going to produce great results for me at, in potentially what we would consider to be, unsustainable levels of use of PEDs for the shortest possible period of time for the best possible outcome, okay? And ultimately, I think that's where my responsibility lies. It's not in saying don't use these drugs. It's not in saying don't do it. I'm trying to find a way to help people to get the best possible outcomes that they can get without taking on unnecessary risks. There are no methylated orals in this program, apart from anadrol that sits there, and we might or we might not use it. Okay, there are not large volumes of veterinary drugs unapproved for human use. There are no research chemicals here. There are no unknown quantities here. This is in my opinion, intelligent use of growth promoters. This is recognizing the value of caloric intake in the form of carbohydrate substrate well over maintenance values, but in a way that means you just don't get fat really fast. And it's the use of increases in volume load, okay, in such a way that we can realize the maximum return possible, okay, on a body part by body part basis. So there is a Victor Black's leg program, and then potentially at the end of that 12-week period, you have a washout phase, and then you can go on to another structured program that might be suitable for you. So that's an overview of the Black Death program. Hopefully that makes rational sense. Everybody that I've explained this to so far kind of nods their head, goes, yes, I get that. There's nothing in there that you need to provide evidence on, Victor. It all makes logical, rational sense. No, that's not the way I'm doing it at the moment. No, that's not the way that most people put together training programs. So, as I said, if you are someone that historically has struggled with, and say, look, I'm a hard gainer, I think this is a program that you should try. You should justify the investment in saying, okay, so here is a model that makes a lot of sense, but it's not what you're doing at the moment. There are subtle differences in the way that we execute the program that I promise you, if you do them correctly and you work very diligently, you get the return. Now, I want to show you just one last thing. The program is delivered in what we refer to as a visual database. This is a tool called Airtable. It really doesn't matter. You can think of this as kind of like an Excel spreadsheet. The difference, of course, is that it's not something that you email back and forth between people. It's kind of more like Google Sheets, where it's live, where you can basically log in and get information. You can put information in, and I can put information in. So I do actually offer, in the framework of the the framework of the Black Death program, support for this program. But I have a couple of caveats, and that basically is, if you want me to support you in this process, you need to complete the data in that tool. Because the first thing I will be doing if you ask for help is having a look at your tool, looking at your scale weight increases, looking at your caloric increases, looking at your drug dosage increases, looking at your progression photographs, looking at all this information and looking for small adjustments that I can make to the plan that might assist you. If you don't use that tool, okay, I'm not interested in supporting you, because I don't want to be sitting there with the emails coming back and forth with your photographs. No, if you want support, I will support the program. Okay, you can reach out to me and say, can you have a look at my progression and give me some advice on what I might or might need to do to get a better outcome here. Sure, you just need to use that reporting capacity, including the photographs, the blood pressure, the blood glucose, the scale weight, and all of that information. If you keep all that information, if you follow the program the way the program is intended to be followed, then I can and I will support you. If you don't, I will not. I am not going to be drawn into hours of trying to help people with emails and photograph attachments and stuff like that. That has the potential to end very, very badly for me in terms of time management. So the program and the support is available for anybody that's interested. Reach out to me, send me a private message, send me an email to victorblackmasterclass@gmail.com, and let me know. And if you're interested, you can get started on the Victor Black Death leg program. Sawadee Cup.